In this lecture, we will be building on our discussion of control theory as it relates to the work of sociologists, and in this case, the writings of Dr. Walter Reckless. We will build on this by introducing the subject of deterrence and introducing another theoretical school of thought, rational choice theory. The penal system, or what is also referred to as the correctional system, lies at the heart of deterrence. We'll take a closer look at this and its effect, but let's begin with the history of the penal system. When we're talking about the correctional system, what we have to realize is that it incorporates things like incarceration, but it's a much wider and larger landscape than that. Basically, it is connecting into a network a variety of agencies that are associated with the administration of jurisprudence, and of course, it connects with the prison system, community-based programs, the system of parole, and probation. The design and ultimately the history of the American system of confinement as it relates to offenders is something that originates outside of the continental United States. In fact, the penal system as we know it today and what has led or paved the way for the penitentiary system that we now use with regard to corrections is something that can be traced all the way back to 18th century England. The concept of incarceration was not the first approach toward implementing consequences for deviance or deviant behavior. It was not the only means with regard to dealing with criminals and those who are, in a sense, public offenders. Originally, there was a system of corporal punishment, which was brutal and abhorrent to not only people living in the 17th and 18th centuries, but of course, for many of us looking back at these systems of deterrence. The transition from corporal punishment to incarceration is something that, at least in Western civilization, began in Great Britain and again was associated with the 18th century. We see at nearly the same time similar systems of correction emerging in Central and Northern Europe as well. The system, however, that appears to be most historically linked to our current system of criminal justice and deterrence as it relates to incarceration is associated with England. When we're taking a look at how the English and originally the English colonies approached, in this case, corrections, we realize that, again, the notion of a penal colony was very, very common. This idea of complete isolation from a social group or from the society as part of the corrective process. It really wasn't corrections in a traditional sense. It was, in a sense, looking at public offenders or offenders as being broken, as being individuals who in no way, shape, or form could be reintroduced into society or reformed in any way. They had a very strong, almost moralistic, almost biological approach toward the reasoning behind deviant behavior. So the idea of isolating them, removing them from society, removing them from the community as a threat, was very much of a kind of an overarching, or governing principle. And we see the same kinds of approaches in other aspects of public health. If you have ever had a chance to study the history of mental health care, for example, and the connections between the kind of mental health practices that we had historically in the United States in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and those of Europe, and more specifically of England itself, you see similar kinds of approaches. Yet, in terms of mental health, the idea of curability, which again is another term that is very old-fashioned in its nature and how it was used as a guiding philosophy in addressing medical issues. But the idea of curability was something that was part of these early systems. But both the correction system, the penal system in places like England and Europe, and then, of course, the United States, and the system that was in place during, for example, the Victorian age, um, that was used to engage and understand and deal with mental health issues, both align themselves in terms of isolation and incarceration. Of course, it is a blessing that over time and through literally centuries of medical research and social reform, we have moved away from these very penal forms of and isolationist forms of um, corrections and of, in this case, um, public health. Prison reform is something that is also part of the 18th century. It really occurs in the mid to late 18th century, and we see it codified into law in the 1790s. But prison reform is associated with a variety of individuals. We see prison reform in Great Britain being associated with John Howard. John Howard is an Englishman who today is assigned the fatherhood of the penitentiary system. It is, again, something that social historians are connecting to his work in the late 1700s. And this penitentiary system, although it begins in England, is something that spreads throughout the British colonies and, of course, in the nation building that occurred once independence was reached. And especially that is the case here in the United States. The penitentiary system of John Howard is something that we see strongly reflected in the East Coast um, at the turn of the century, moving into the 19th century. Places like Pennsylvania, for example, were very important to the development of a national penal code, but then it will begin to spread throughout the East Coast, and then it will spread west as the United States grows into its nationhood, as it is represented by the continental U.S. today. So there is this kind of East Coast to West Coast spread of these ideas. And again, we see the same kinds of historical trends when we look at how we approached public health issues in general, specifically mental health. But the penitentiary system is something that we're going to look at independent of that, and we will look at it as, at least in terms of the Pennsylvania model, at the turn of the century, as we move into the 19th century, as being the kind of starting point for the modern prison system here in the United States. One of the things that I also have to stress, and that makes the penitentiary system in its earliest forms different from either the corporal punishment or the early practices of incarceration that predated it, is that it was focused not solely on isolation, that there was, in a sense, a push, and we see this in the writings of John Howard as well, but of course we see it in the work of municipal writings, which followed well into the 19th century. We see this focus on a humane approach toward deterrence. Right? Imprisonment is the ultimate form of deterrence for any sort of criminal act. It is the consequence for a criminal action. Of course, in this case, something like the death penalty, which shifts us back toward more of a corporal approach, is even probably above that as a major deterrence, but realize that the death penalty is something, at least in the United States, where it is being applied on a state level. It is something that, in a sense, is relegated to only certain levels of crime, whereas corrections and incarceration are a form of deterrence that is applied to a much wider range of crime types and crime categories, and we'll take a look at this in both the federal and state level as part of this lecture. So this idea of a humane approach was part of the penitentiary system. The other component of this, and this is again where we see that kind of bridge between public health and in this case the penal system, is that there was an increasing interest, especially through the 19th century, on understanding recidivism. And what I mean by recidivism is a situation in which an individual is introduced to the correction systems, or system rather. He or she is serving their time, and then they ultimately will be rehabilitated um, through, in this case, behavioral modification, and it is still present, and that it sounds almost dystopian when we talk about behavioral modification, but these kinds of correctional systems do strip an individual down to their most elementary form of self and then rebuild them back up in a way that is more akin to what the surrounding society is designed like, or the kinds of norms and normative behaviors that we associate with the surrounding society. But nonetheless, there was this focus on getting an individual ready to be reintroduced back into society. Recidivism is a term that in sociological circles and criminal justice studies is a factor or a variable that is associated with a person then returning to a criminal act that reintroduces them to the penal system. So recidivism in this case is something that we would like to see diminished over time. And it's still something that's part of our dialogue today. So when a prisoner leaves a system of deterrence, does he or she return to their old ways and eventually become incarcerated yet again? Or are they equipped with the skills to adapt to their previous associations, maybe change their previous associations, and move on in a life that is more aligned with the majority of individuals within the society? What Durkheim had said was collective sentiments or sediments. So the idea here is, you know, are we reforming individuals? And that was another aspect of the penitentiary system, and that was new. The American prison system is the subject that we will take a much closer look at with regard to this lecture and the overall content of the course that this lecture is a part of. As I said previously, when we look at incarceration in the United States, we recognize the late 18th century to be a time when our current system, maybe not our modern system, and we'll kind of differentiate between the two, but structurally our current system of how we deal with crime and how we attempt to deter crime was laid into place. One of the unique qualities of the American system early on is that this idea of humane approaches toward incarceration and, in this case, reducing recidivism were things that were very much driving philosophies in the people who were designing the system. And so early on in the American system of deterrence as it relates to incarceration, we see things like vital statistics being incorporated into the process of how prisoners are being organized. For example, prior to the 1790s, there are situations because of poverty and because of crime where groups of people, even families, are incarcerated. As we approach the turn of the century and as social reform really takes shape, not only in criminal justice but across a wide variety of public health areas, we start to have individuals who are talking about separating out males from females and adults from juveniles. Now, this is something that we take for granted today, but this is something that was not always part of the approach toward deterrence in the West. And so this was something that really took off well and grew in popularity in the United States. However, as was the case in Europe and in England, one of the, I would say, weaknesses of the corrections system, the penal system, here in the United States was overcrowding. So once we got a more humane, reformist system in place by the mid to late 18th century, by the 19th century, it is already a system that is overwhelmed. The same can be said about the prison system in England. However, I would say that in Europe, it's a 50-50 split. So in places like Northern Europe, we do not see this kind of overcrowding. And we'll take a closer look at how and why that was the case later on. But needless to say, overcrowding was an early problem within both the English and American correction system. By the late 19th century, this reform approach toward incarceration, toward deterrence, this movement away from more corporal models, was very much popularized and was something that was growing state to state. How did this take shape? Well, ultimately, we started to see better order being brought to corrections. We recognized corrections as becoming an official part of criminal justice systems, of the criminal justice system in the United States. We saw greater attention being placed on vital statistics, as I said before, males, females, age also became an important factor or variable that was being studied. And then, of course, circumstances regarding the seriousness of the crime were also things that were starting to further organize, classify, categorize how corrections and deterrence in general was being implemented. Because remember that corrections in this case is probably the most well-known and most obvious form of deterrence that we see within criminal justice. However, it is just one option. And as we continue to grow and learn about human psychology, human physiology and anatomy, and the role that environment and society play in shaping the life of an individual, we start to realize rather quickly that there are really a plethora of different kinds of philosophies and practices that can be incorporated into or under the umbrella term of deterrence. The reformatory era, which we see emerging in the 19th century and really shaping the entire system of corrections and deterrence in the United States, gives way or bridges us into what is referred to as the modern era of American prisons. This is something that is very closely associated with the 20th century. So when you're kind of organizing these ideas, really when you get to 1900 and you move into the opening decades of the 20th century, this is going to be the start of our modern era as it relates to deterrence and the role that correctional systems play in that sociological phenomenon. As we see in this modern system, there is a clear line that differentiates adult offenders from juvenile offenders. And there are 1,001 different theoretical, both historical and sociological ideas regarding why we see this differentiation occurring in the penal system. There are some very obvious qualities that you could probably list on a single piece of paper, but there are also some rather interesting behavioralist and reformatory qualities that should also be considered when we are looking at the modern age and why adults and juveniles are traditionally separated. The basic premise here is that when you're looking at adult offenders, these are individuals who are at a different stage in their life histories. They're at a different stage in the process of socialization and ultimately enculturation. There is still growth, there is still change, there is still the ability to reform oneself or to change oneself's place in society, but more often than not, and we see this in the criminal justice system with regard to how juvenile delinquents are being treated, juveniles are framed a little bit differently. Juveniles and their interaction with deterrence is much more temporary in nature, and it is much more transitional in nature. There is a much stronger emphasis on attempting to address those issues in one's environment, in one's life history that has contributed to a delinquent act or to some sort of deviance. And so, even though juveniles today, depending on the category of crime and the level of criminal activity, can be incorporated into an adult system, generally, and this is again part of that reformatory era and the modern age or the modern era, it is believed that juveniles should be separated out from adults and treated differently. Well, let's take a step back rather for a moment and take a closer look at this idea of deterrence, because that's really the core subject of this lecture and what you're looking at in relation to this lecture. Um, Authors will very often look at deterrence as a kind of doctrine. They'll refer to it as a deterrence doctrine. And really, deterrence and the concept of legal punishment or legal penalty as it relates to an act that is recognized to be deviant and ultimately criminal, these are inseparable. You have to look at the doctrine of deterrence in direct relation to legal penalty rather, as it exists under the law. Now, there are a couple of expressions of punishment that we should incorporate into this lecture, and they're things that your readings will also reinforce as you are moving through them. And the first is this notion of celerity. Celerity, in a sense, is going to relate very closely to the concept of swiftness, right? How quickly and or how swiftly rather a criminal sanction is being applied by the state, uh, an immediate consequence. And we juxtapose that with certainty. Certainty is another concept or term that we use to delineate or differentiate punishment. Certainty refers to the probability of not only the punishment but being apprehended for the crime. It is more of that constant looming threat of force that Max Weber was alluding to when he was taking a look at how societies were controlled. So the certainty that if I participate in a behavior that is recognized to be criminal, the certainty that I will be apprehended, that I will lose my liberties in terms of my ability to walk freely outside of an institutionalized setting, and that after apprehension, I will be ultimately incarcerated if the crime will be of a certain categorical nature or a certain level. And it's important to think about these concepts because deterrence is something that is internal to the individual. Deterrence is that internal control when we were looking at control theory, that brief amount of time when you are making a judgment call. Should I participate in this? And what are the consequences of my action or actions? And generally, when you're dealing with an individual who is an adult, when you're dealing with an individual who is at or above the age of 13 or 14 years, you're dealing with an individual that has a well-developed, maybe not completely developed, but a well-developed rational mind. And it's that rationality, and we'll get to rational theory in a few minutes here, But it's that rational thought that deterrence taps into. Right? Will the judgment for my actions be swift? Does that deter me? Will the judgment or the consequences of my actions be certain? Does that deter me from participating in a crime? Right? So, what has become known as deterrence theory, and I would say that deterrence theory can easily be broken down into a variety of additional theoretical schools of thought. Deterrence theory is something that is important for us to really take time and understand more deeply. Those that are proponents of deterrence theory are going to recognize two levels of deterrence that are hardwired into the modern legal system. The first one, and these are a little bit different from the two that I mentioned with regard to those individual thoughts and controls. These are things that are a little bit more public, a little more society-wide with regard to how we perceive them or how we are socialized to understand them. The first is when there are clear consequences for criminal activity. What in popular media or within a society or the layout of an urban plan tell us that there is a consequence for criminal activity? A patrol car would be a visual consequence. A police station, a minimum or maximum security prison. And then a second level that very often will be addressed is when is there public evidence for this kind of consequence? So when there is public record of crimes and consequences. If you have a relative who enjoys, maybe you enjoy, going through the local paper and taking a look at the police blotter, that is an example of a public expression or public evidence of consequences for crimes. It's really speaking also to human nature. I'm the kind of person where when I look at a police blotter, I say, man, I'm glad I decided not to do something like that because it does not sound like it's necessarily something that I would like to be caught up in, and the consequences of which I would not like any part of. So there's that feel-good quality to it. But more deeply, and this is what the sociologist is really focusing in on when he or she is looking at, in this case, deterrence theory or a variety of that, is how does that police blotter, how does that public evidence of the consequence of a crime cause or stimulate the individual to choose not to follow that path? Right? And then how does that individual, through the network of a society, through social relationships, and over time, how does that become more of a group or society-wide or a communal phenomenon? Let's take a look at whether or not the numbers are aligning with the deterrence concepts, because the idea here is that the more prisons you have, the greater expression of deterrence you should see in not only the mind of the individual, but also the collective society-wide perspective on why not to participate in deviant behavior. Well, unfortunately, the numbers, and this is something that many of us have lived in over the last decade, if not longer, the numbers continue to increase. So the more examples that we have for some sort of deterrence or some sort of punishment, that it is potentially certain, maybe not swift, but potentially certain, this may not be adequate enough to deter people from a life of crime or from a criminal activity. So if you take a closer look at this summary of public census data as it relates to incarceration rates between 2000 and 2009, you see that over time, the number of prisoners who are incorporated into this penal system, specifically being incarcerated, are increasing. Now, There is a per capita component to this. There's also a component to this that relates to population growth. We know that populations are growing. However, the thought here, though, is that there should not be a corresponding increase per se in criminal activity. Causation, correlation, and the divide between these two concepts tell us that just by having a larger population of individuals should not mean that we have a greater number of criminals. Right? But the idea here is that we have to question whether or not deterrence as a form of social control is working. Juxtaposed in the same chart is an annual percentage of change, and you'll see that this fluctuates quite a bit more. I would say that this may be the truer measure of deterrence and of maybe things that are contributing to criminal activities that are not directly relatable to the certainty of punishment. Is that over time at particular times of year, there are percentage shifts in crimes and in the number of individuals who are participating in crime. But needless to say, we generally would want to see the trends that are depicted here to be almost reversed if possible. And that's a goal that many in the criminal justice system have. Here's another depiction to look at. In this case, gathering data from the same time period, 2000 to 2009, looking and comparing two different levels within the penal system or the correctional system, the federal level and the state level, and then we'll focus more on the state level. And a lot of this has to do with the federalist systems, the republic that we live in ultimately, the democratic republic that we live in. But ultimately, we realize that states' rights and the overview or the purview of the federal government are different. They're similar but different, and so we're seeing that charted out a little bit differently here as well. So one of the things, though, that we would want to take a look at is compare a federal crime to a state level crime and how that changes over time and when there might be a spike, an increase, or a decrease. A really good topic to use in comparison to a graphic like this would be something like domestic terrorism. So we know that domestic terrorism as a kind of deviance, group deviance, and individual deviance, is something that has been on the increase, but it has had periods of time when it plateaus. It has had periods of time when there has been an upsurge in its expression or a downtick in its expression as well. As we enter or approach 2020, one of the things that is spiking a lot of federal offenses as it relates to domestic forms of terrorism relate to the kind of public and political perspectives on immigration and states' rights. And these kinds of situations are causing a spike in this case, federal crime rates, at least those that are being moved into the judicial system, and when we do have punishments being established. The question here is, do we also see a reflection in some of these graphics of changes in laws? So when we start to see more federal power increasing, after 9/11 we saw the federal government and their judicial power and their reach in terms of criminal justice increasing, and we saw states' rights and state level contributions to those now more federal concerns diminishing. Those were also contributing to declines in state, in this case, charges or state imprisonment rates versus federal imprisonment rates. So these are all things to consider. And what I'm getting at here is that it's not a linear construct. It's something that really does ebb and flow, and it is also something that has many variables, confounding and otherwise, that need to be considered as we are starting to test some of these theories rather, and the impact that deterrence has on the larger society-wide trends of criminal activity. More evidence, or at least data, for us to look closely at. On the left-hand side of the image, we see a date range of 1990 to 2009. So we see a decade-long, really period of time, nearly 2 decades, that we are looking at. In this case, we are looking specifically at imprisonment rates versus individuals who are involved in sentencing. And again, imprisonment is always kind of the end result of that process, but not all uh, sentenced criminals will end up in the prison system. And so we can start to juxtapose some of those statistics as well. To the right, we see sentenced prisoners who are admitted into state prisons by the type of crime, or at least the type of admission. So we see parole violators, and we see new court commitments. So this is the expression here that we have an individual who is already served or has already been sentenced or found guilty in some way, shape, or form. They may be on parole as opposed to being in a prison system. And now are they violating that parole? And if they are violating that parole, they may now have to pay the certain consequence, the certainty of their act, and they, in terms of deterrence, and they would be imprisoned as part of that violation, versus individuals who are newly arriving to the court system. And these would be statistics that would help us better understand a true rise in crime. The idea that, are we seeing more people involved in criminal activities versus are we seeing people who have been already sentenced as it relates to a criminal act, now violating an aspect of their parole or returning to a the crime or a related crime that now is resulting in their imprisonment as well. And so that's another thing to keep your eye on, because again, really what is most disturbing to people who are working in the criminal justice system are individuals who are new, right? Who are just now appearing in the court system. And then the other concern is recidivism, right? Do we have an individual who was either threatened with imprisonment, who was then placed on parole, or who served for a very short amount of time, maybe even awaiting trial, was counted toward their overall prison term, and they were then released back into society with a small amount of restriction. Did they return to a criminal activity? And that would be that recidivism that we are concerned about. Then we have to follow up by asking, well, why might that be the case? Why did the individual return to a criminal act or violate their parole in this case? Is it environmental, or is there something else at work here? So these are important statistics for really understanding whether or not these theoretical frameworks and their application as it relates to criminal justice studies, if that's really contributing to a solution. And then just briefly, another table that again spans about a decade of time, 2000 to 2009 in this case. And this is giving you some trends with regard to, or statistics with regard to categories of offense. So we have violent offenders. This includes murder, non-negligent manslaughter, rape, other sexual assaults, robbery, any violent offenses in a sense, versus property kinds of offenses. This would include things like larceny, motor vehicle theft, fraud, burglary would fall under this category as well. Versus the drug category, and this is another topic that we will be taking a much closer look at as the societal norms surrounding drug use and particular types of drugs, not only alcohol, things like nicotine, but also things like marijuana, how that is changing over time and how the criminal justice system is having to adapt to that. And again, that's a state by state kind of process, unless the federal government does decide in a new election cycle that they also wish to legalize, but we'll save that for another lecture. And then things like public ordered offenses, or a category of that. In a sense, that would include weapons charges, things like drunk driving, and again, that would be more state to state. Maybe some sort of court offense, public order offenses, property owners, violators there, so on and so forth, and then a variety of kind of an unspecified category, which could include even juvenile offenses and things like that. But you can see some of the trends there, the changes in relation to the total percentages of change. So these are all really important statistics to take a closer look at when we are evaluating some of these theories. Then rational theory is the last thing I'd like to share with you as part of this lecture. It is something that is generally part of most readings for courses that address crime and deviant behavior. Rational choice theory, as it's more properly named, is looking at deterrence through an economic lens. So this may seem problematic, but it does work out. If you think about economic behavior, at least in a macro sense, and the concept or the idea of maximization, sometimes what's referred to as maximization theory in economic circles. This is the idea that we make rational choices that result in gain. So we do things, we choose jobs that in some way, shape, or form will help us to prosper. Now, I understand that there are situations where you may choose a job because you get more time off versus pay, or you may choose a job because, let's say, it's part of your public ministry. You could be making $100,000 a year as a public defender, but you choose to, in this case, teach in a parochial elementary school because it's part of your mission. Those situations kind of have to be taken out of this to understand the rationale behind this theory. The economist is looking at gain, and there are economic theories which incorporate things like job quality and time off and things like that, even benefits as being part of gain. But the idea here, as it relates to deterrence, is that the decision-making process on the part of a potential criminal will incorporate gains and losses in that decision-making process. It really focuses on the criminal as having a rational mind at the time he or she is choosing their type of behavior. What has been assigned to this through the work of economists is this idea of expected utility principle. So the expected utility principle, again, is something that states that people will make rational decisions based on the extent to which they expect the choice to maximize their profits or to benefit them in some way, and to minimize, in this case, cost or loss. And so again, weighing your options really is what we're looking at here when we're talking about rational choice theory. So just in the same way that you may be choosing a job or choosing a benefits package as part of an employment situation, you may use the same part of your rational mind, or you might weigh and measure the same kinds of choices when you are um, faced with something that could result in a criminal act and the certainty of apprehension and the certainty potentially of incarceration. This is something that also will start to work its way into recidivism. The idea that I've been there, I've been in prison, I have seen the direct consequences of my actions, I have a rational mind, I have received counseling both in a prison setting and outside of a prison setting. I have a system of parole, which is something that I'm constantly connecting to, uh, where I and others can monitor what I am doing now that I am outside of that correctional landscape. And am I choosing now to perpetrate yet again the same crime or a crime that may result in my incarceration? Because if I am on parole and I'm returned to a criminal act, my chances for incarceration are much higher. And the speed of my sentencing is also much, much higher as well. So recidivism is also something that is relatable to rational choice theory. So the entire theoretical framework really is based on the assumption that one possesses the facilities to make rational decisions regarding conduct at the time a crime occurs or could potentially occur. And this is something that when we start looking more closely at mental health issues, and whether or not somebody is in a rational state of mind um, at the time that a crime occurs, this becomes very, very muddy. And so it's very challenging for us, but it is another topic that we will take a closer look at in a later lecture.